I'm John Herder. It's 24th day of January. Great as always to have you along, everybody. In a nutshell, From the Experts is a virtual networking and opportunity flow accelerator, helping leaders across industries connect very quickly in a brief, moderated, interactive show format, like a TED Talk with interactive discussion. So what's in it for you? Our promise, if everything goes well, your curiosity sparked, new ideas, accelerate into action, and you may have helped yourself or someone else solve that problem, make a connection, reaching the opportunity faster. Welcome to the 2023 Energy Transition Channel, brought to you in partnership with the Endeavor Institute, experts at developing transformational leaders for the future. Folks, before we get started, kindly mute yourself if you could, so that we can all hear our guest expert, who I'm going to introduce right this moment. Folks, welcome to Rick Beuttel. Rick joins us today from Bloomenergy, where he's vice president of Bloom's hydrogen business, responsible for the electrolyzer product line. Rick joined Bloom about a year ago after 31 years with Air Products, where he was vice president of large project business development for Americas, leading to the development of well over $10 billion in hydrogen derivative investments. A global expert, Rick is passionate about the role of clean hydrogen in the energy transition, and he's joining us today, as he said, from Bloom headquarters in San Jose, California. Rick, honestly had a great time, enjoyed our time together, and glad you could stop in, connect, and share latest insights and ideas with the FTE network today. Over to you.
John, thank you. The pleasure is mine. And again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's nice to see some old friends on the call, and you know who you are. And I also look forward to meeting and making some new friends today, and hopefully answering some questions that you all may have about hydrogen. I think I do recognize and want to make clear that for a group of this size, there's probably a wide range of knowledge and understanding of hydrogen. So we're going to keep it reasonably high level. We'll deep dive on a couple of points, and then really hope for an engaging, hard driving sort of Q&A and discussion session at the end. So with that said, so why are we here? Why the focus on hydrogen, and why now? I think three main points I'd like to have you all think about, and this is a little bit of the military approach. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'll tell you it, and then I'll tell you what I told you. So three main points. One, we have a climate problem. I don't really think that's up for debate anymore. Solution of this climate problem and holding our global temperature rise at 1.5 degrees C will require a great many tools to address. High on the list, of course, is renewable electricity, wind, solar, hydro. But additionally, and a great complement to that renewable electricity resource, is clean hydrogen and derivatives of clean hydrogen. And we'll talk a little bit about what those are later in the discussion. So that's the next point. What is clean hydrogen? What are derivatives? And what are some of the best uses and applications for clean hydrogen for decarbonization? And then finally, we'll talk in a little bit more detail about so-called green hydrogen. Of course, that doesn't mean that it's physically green. That just means it's made from a renewable resource like wind, solar, hydro, and an electrolyzer device. We'll talk about what those are. And an interesting point I'll flesh out a little bit for you is why the cheapest electrolyzer doesn't necessarily yield the cheapest hydrogen. That's what we'll cover, and I want to leave plenty of time at the end for a good discussion. So hydrogen. There are hydrogen forecasts all over the place. You can't turn your computer on today without seeing some new article about hydrogen, a new position from the IEA, from McKinsey, from Wood Mackenzie, from the Hydrogen Council. Everybody saying hundreds of billions of dollars in euro, hundreds of gigawatts of electricity and electrolyzers are going to go towards hydrogen. And why is that? So one, as I mentioned, we have a global need to limit further temperature rise, and that means limiting greenhouse gas emissions. Second, over 130 countries, or 90% or more of the global GDP, have announced net zero goals. Hydrogen is, of course, one of many tools in the toolkit. My own personal belief is that 50 years from now, and I won't see it, but my children or their children will see it, is that everything on the planet will be powered by clean electricity I'm going to lower the poll so that I can see all of your smiling faces. Or clean hydrogen and derivatives, because not every process lends itself to direct electrification. And here's what I'm thinking about and talking about here as examples. One would be heavy transportation, trucks, buses, airplanes. Second would be hard to decarbonize industries. And probably you've all heard the spiel on hard to decarbonize industries. Not all of these processes lend themselves to direct electrification. So I'm thinking here of many parts of the steelmaking value chain, from making hot briquetted iron or direct reduced hydrogen or direct reduced iron, using hydrogen to add energy to furnaces, cleaning up the hydrogen already used in annealing, the synthesis of cement. Roughly a third of the CO2 footprint associated with making cement could be addressed with hydrogen. Interestingly, if you didn't know this, 4 to 5% of mankind's CO2 footprint comes from cement. Glass furnaces, many other heavy industrial processes are not amenable to electrification. Feeding people. So half the mouths on the planet are enabled by two German scientists early in the last century, Haber and Bosch, inventing the synthesis of ammonia. That creates roughly another 2 to 3% of mankind's carbon footprint. Without the synthesis of ammonia, I would say it again, simply half the people on the planet will starve. The interesting thing about ammonia is, of course, it's NH3 chemically. Interestingly, there's no carbon atom there, of course. So ammonia, as I see it, has a very huge role to play going forward. One, simply as continuing to feed all of us. Two, as a fuel. And many of the marine engine producers and many other industries are looking at the direct suitability for burning clean ammonia as a fuel to decarbonize, the maritime industry, for example. And then third, of course, is another leg of the ammonia stool, which would be using ammonia as a hydrogen carrier. So if there's a large renewable resource in some remote part of the world where there's not humans that can directly benefit from it, and you want to use that renewable resource to make clean hydrogen, and then you want to move that clean hydrogen to someplace in the world where it can be beneficially deployed. Ammonia is an ideal molecule because it transports much more easily than liquid hydrogen very long distances. And here I'm talking about between continents. So I'm very bullish on ammonia as a fuel of the future. And I think other fuels of the future that, make this cut in whole or in part would be clean methanol, would be renewable diesel, and of course, sustainable aviation fuel. And the synthesis of all of those fuels requires large volumes of clean hydrogen. And in the end, either today or in the near future, results in products that are traded on their carbon intensity. So we're very excited about the clean hydrogen opportunity there to decarbonize transportation. Finally, energy storage. Where it is economical to store hydrogen, and important to note that that's not everywhere. Every place in the world is not blessed with underground caverns or salt domes that can be hollowed out to store hydrogen. But where it's economical, hydrogen can be used to store peak renewables. So think of times when there's just so much renewable energy production that the cost goes to zero, or in many cases in some parts of the world, the cost goes negative. So you can store that hydrogen when it costs very little to produce it, and then you can use it for the generation of clean electric power at times when the renewable resource isn't available. Storing hydrogen, of course, as I alluded to, has its own interesting technical challenges, and let's see if we get into that in the group discussion. It is a big group, so I think I'll just spend a moment talking about the so-called colors of hydrogen. Colors are something which I think is beneficial to explain to the world at large how different flavors of hydrogen are produced. Personally, I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is to think about what's the carbon intensity, how many kilograms of CO2 are emitted into the atmosphere per kilogram of hydrogen. But for today's purposes, what I'd like you to think about is the majority of hydrogen produced in the world today, the overwhelming majority, and what I spent a good portion of my career making a trade on, is so-called gray hydrogen. And what that means is you start with a hydrocarbon, natural gas, coal, another hydrocarbon like naphtha, et cetera, put it through a reforming process, and then purify the hydrogen out and use that hydrogen in many industrial and refining and chemical processes. What's good about that is it's relatively low cost, it's well understood, it's simple. What's not so good about it is it releases 10 times or more by mass in CO2 into the atmosphere per unit volume of hydrogen that you're getting out and using for that process. Then there is blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen, very similar to gray. You start with a hydrocarbon, you reform it, in some cases with oxygen, in some cases without. But on the back end of the facility, you can capture the carbon dioxide in certain chemical processes and then secret it away, store it away for all eternity, 5,000 to 10,000 feet underground, if you have geology that would enable doing that safely and securely. And then finally, green. So after spending my first part of my career doing gray hydrogen and blue hydrogen, I'm now sort of up to my neck in green hydrogen opportunities, where we have adopted our proven fuel cell solid oxide technology, which we've deployed over 1 gigawatt of, into the world's most efficient electrolyzer. An electrolyzer is a device that produces so-called green hydrogen, literally by taking our friend, the water molecule, which is H2O, we all remember high school and university chemistry, and using renewable energy and breaking the bonds, holding those two atoms together, holding hydrogen and oxygen together, and then making hydrogen with zero carbon footprint, zero carbon intensity, again, provided you're using clean electricity. So that's colors. And, we can get into more on that if there are questions. And there are many other crazy colors. I think there must be a random color generator somewhere out there in the world, which comes up with new characteristics of hydrogen and new colors, but that's for another day. Hydrogen, it's an interesting molecule with interesting physical characteristics as a commodity. For example, moving hydrogen long distances on a continent is best done by pipeline. Of course, we all know pipelines are expensive and time-consuming to construct. You'll hear people talking a lot about liquefaction of hydrogen, and liquefaction of hydrogen was first really widely deployed here in the United States in the 1950s for the space program and NASA. And if you're at all familiar with moving large volumes of natural gas between continents in LNG or liquefied natural gas, very, very similar concept, except hydrogen you have to get a lot colder. You have to get it under minus 250 degrees C, and that requires a lot of CapEx, a lot of OpEx, a lot of energy. And of course, the challenge to keep something that cold for a long period of time means you literally lose 1 to 2% of your hydrogen per day or more as it sits there and is well insulated of a thermos bottle as you can produce. So that works really well for small volumes by truck for a few hundred miles, but not for thousands of tons over a multi-week ocean journey. So then what? So what do you do? So back to our old friend ammonia, like I talked about. The global supply chain already exists. As we discussed, it can be used as a fertilizer, a fuel, or a hydrogen carrier. And if you're using it as a hydrogen carrier at the destination location, you can literally put some energy back into it and crack the ammonia back into its constituent parts of nitrogen and hydrogen. And then, as an old friend of mine says, you just put the nitrogen back where you found it in the air and use the hydrogen. Other derivatives of clean hydrogen, as we talked about, that will be besides hydrogen fuels of the future are SAF, renewable diesel, and methanol. Of course, all of these clean processes are more expensive than gray hydrogen, i.e. if it was cheaper to make green hydrogen than gray hydrogen already, we'd already be doing it, and we wouldn't have a world full of steam methane reformers all over the place making hydrogen and venting a lot of carbon dioxide. Part of the transition, and depending upon which continent you're on watching this FTE show, incentives are paving the way. So in the US, a lot of publicity in mid-late 2022 around the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which established clear incentives to drive production and use of clean hydrogen and its derivatives, created credits for renewable power generation, production tax credits for clean hydrogen, and an increased 45Q tax credit for sequestration of carbon dioxide associated with blue hydrogen production, has put the US currently in a leading position internationally on the drive for clean hydrogen. Other economies, of course, will match this in one form or another. And just last week, the EU made a very important announcement in this direction. We at Bloom are very excited, of course, on the focus on clean hydrogen, the legacy it will allow us to leave our children and grandchildren. Our electrolyzer technology, which is called solid oxide electrolysis, is significantly to me is 15 to 30% more efficient than other electrolyzer technologies like PEM and alkaline. And in fact, we set a world record for efficiency at the Idaho National Labs last year with our technology. I won't bore you on this with the physics and chemistry reasons for that, because I don't want to make you squirm.
Right.
But highlighting, it's not the lowest upfront capital cost of the technologies, but when factoring in the efficiency, it yields the lowest cost of hydrogen. It's about 3/4 of the cost of making a hydrogen in an electrolyzer is the electricity itself. The technology was developed by our founder and CEO for the Mars mission. We talked about that. And we have been commercializing this technology as a fuel cell, which is actually a much more demanding service technically than splitting water, for over 15 years. We commercialized our new gigascale factory just down the street from Elon Musk's gigafactory in Fremont last year, and we can build 2 gigawatt per year of electrolysis. We're most excited about these applications of the fuels of the future: ammonia, methanol, renewable diesel, and SAF. Those processes are exothermic, and we can integrate our electrolysis with the synthesis of those fuels. So maybe just to wrap this up and get to the discussion, which is really what I'm most excited about, 3 points. We have a climate problem. Clean hydrogen and its derivatives are one of the tools in the toolkit to help solve it. We talked about what is clean hydrogen and the main colors. And we talked about the next generation electrolysis technology that's available today from Bloom to help, along with many other innovations, lower the cost of clean hydrogen. John, I think with that, why don't I give you the keys back and let's have us chat, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks very much, Rick. Hey, take a look. I just released the poll responses. And if you have any comments on that, take a quick look. And while you're doing that, yes, we're going to open the floor now. That's we always start in the FTE. We have the expert talk followed by the interaction, the group discussion with the discussion question our expert has for you. So we use that to get the conversation rolling, but obviously feel free to ask Rick a question, share your experience with the group in a brief 60-second share so we can hear many opinions. Just use the raise hand tool button on the bar so we can call on you. And if I call on you and you want to pass, hey, no problem. We'll move right along. So when you want to share, it'd be great if you just share your name and who you're with and keep the chat box rolling. Speaking of which, we've got some questions already in there, Rick. Do you have any comments on the poll itself? Anything strike you?
So let me go back to the poll. I'm sorry, you caught me a little flat-footed because I was had jumped over to the chat questions, of course, just to get a sense of what people were thinking. I think what it does show to me is there is a wide diversity, John, of people's familiarity with hydrogen, people's acceptance and understanding of the, quote unquote, as some people say, right, this time it's real. Right. And how we see it being deployed, when we see it being deployed. And I think to me, what is making it real, quote unquote, this time is a much wider acceptance of the climate problem than even as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. And that governments of huge economies are putting incentives in place to jumpstart this and help lower the cost point down even further.
I got it. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. We'll be able to follow up with this later. But hey, so glad many of you could come. And Jonah Margulis, I'm so glad that you could make it today. Would you have anything that you'd like to share with the group or ask Rick about from what you've heard?
Hey, John, thanks. And just got a tornado warning here. So if I duck out, hopefully I'm in an interior room.
Right.
Sorry. So I to your comment, Rick, about ammonia being, you said the fuel of the future, which I tend to agree with. Could you just comment on the safety and handling aspects of that as it scales up? Because we're talking about, it's a whole different level of scale, if you will, for ammonia. Thanks.
So I think that ammonia has certain properties which many of us on this call know, right? It's highly toxic. And I guess one of the positive things about that is you're certainly well aware of when there's even a very, very small ammonia leak. What I would say is all of our options as fuels have issues. As a society, we figured out how to deal with gasoline. In my prior life, before I joined Bloom, I talked a lot to people who were worried about, hydrogen as a fuel for mobility directly. And what I always point out is that if you spill gasoline, right, what happens? It lays there, it puddles on the ground, and it slowly creates a cloud as it evaporates. And that's, one of the most dangerous forms of a combustible on the planet. Whereas if you vent hydrogen, what happens? It's hydrogen, it's lighter than air. It doesn't sit there, it doesn't pose a threat. Your specific point about ammonia, though, is a good one. And why I'm really bullish on ammonia compared to hydrogen or other alternatives besides its carbon intensity is there is already a global supply chain that's been established of literally tens of millions of tons per year that move from continent to continent. And that ammonia moves in cylinders, in trucks, in pipelines in certain parts of the world, right? There's an ammonia pipeline network already existing in the United States. There's actually one in Russia, I realized. I didn't know that up until recently, and probably be interesting to see what's happened, because if my information's right, it connects Russia and the Ukraine, so I suspect there's probably not very much flowing through it right now. And that network is scalable, and I think the ammonia industry has done an enviable job of figuring out how to move that product safely, how to keep it contained, and how to scale up shipping of that material around and using it as more than merely a fertilizer. And finally, maybe the last point would be, of course, moving ammonia around with vessels that burn bunker isn't necessarily the cleanest way to do it. And the ammonia industry, of course, is really pushing the shipbuilders very hard, as well as the engine producers that sell to the shipbuilders very hard, so that in the future, you can use ammonia as a transportation fuel to move, 40-foot containers of televisions to the US, or to move ammonia around itself.
Got it. Thank you for that. So we have one question. We've got many questions in the chat. Good news is, folks, we're capturing this, and I'm sure Rick will follow up afterwards, and so will we. One from Beth. She says, do you feel investors still have cold feet, or following IRA, is hydrogen investments increasing in the US from your perspective?
Yeah,
and then
sorry to interrupt. You have Rupesh that has his hand there.
Yeah, Rupesh. Sure, Rupesh, go ahead, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I know I saw a question about hydrogen and steel plants. I would love to share my perspective and what I've seen, and I would love to hear what others are doing and what others have already done. There's a lot of research obviously going on. I was involved in a CEC project where the key initiative was to introduce hydrogen at varying levels into these industrial burners at the steel plants and understand its impact on the process itself, and if there's any components that need to be changed and modified. And again, I think we've heard this before in some of the other aspects as well. It depends on the concentration that you're introducing into your fuel mixture. Some burners obviously can handle anywhere between like 0 to 20%, 30%, 50%. And there's some testing going on where they're completely redesigning the burners to handle greater than 80% hydrogen. So the verdict is still out there, but there are signs that it can be done. Obviously, there's more research to be done and more questions to be answered. So yes, the topic is being researched.
Rupesh, who are you with?
I'm with GTI Energy or Gas Technology Institute.
Okay, thank you very much. Any
Yeah,
response?
Thanks for joining us, Rupesh, and you raise an excellent point. And I think that if you were a steelmaker and you were to talk to Nucor, you might get a different position on hydrogen than you would get from, say, US Steel, that you might get from a steelmaker in some place like Sweden, for example. So I think there is a bit of horses for courses here. And if you're a mini mill operator, you might take one view of hydrogen where you wouldn't do so much potentially at that unique site. But what might change is your feedstock over time. Your feedstock for the mill might not be so much scrap anymore. In the future, it could be HBI and DRI that is produced with clean hydrogen as the reducing agent, as opposed to starting with natural gas and reforming it, and again, creating a very large carbon footprint. So I think depends upon the problem you're trying to solve.
Thanks for that. So back to this question, do you feel investors still have cold feet, or following IRA, hydrogen investment increasing in the US? And then following up to that, what is the cost to produce green hydrogen? It's kind of a general question.
So a lot to unpack there. Just to do it quickly. The IRA has really supercharged the use case. And, sort of my history would say that good old gray hydrogen, if you're buying it from a pipeline in very large tonnage volumes for your refinery in Texas, depending upon the cost of natural gas, of course, let's say $1 to $1.50 a kilogram. A wise man once told me that, green should cost twice gray. Blue should cost twice gray and green should cost twice blue. So, let's just say $4 to $6 as a rule of thumb for green, depending, of course, on the cost of the renewable electricity. That is the biggest piece of it. So if you consider a $3 a kilogram PTC, you're very close to parity. And I think that is going to drive a lot more adoption. There is certainly a lot more discussion on these projects now around viable and credible offtake scenarios that without some of these production tax credits wouldn't have made sense. And of course, it's very difficult to get, a set of investment bankers in a project finance scenario or a board of directors of a publicly traded company to commit to one of these projects without, a defined offtake scenario. So I see 2023 is the year of things that many people were talking about for the last 2 or 3 years, taking a much closer step to actually happening, whether that's completing FEED studies, moving to FIDs, and really, getting moving. We're excited about it.
Got it. Robert Shields, good to see you. What do you have to say? Robert, you there?
Well, if I could push all the right buttons here.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Good morning. Good morning. Checking in from the Denali Lands in Fairbanks, Alaska. It's a balmy two above. So my question is, and what I've seen is that what's really driving investor interest is context. I've been on a lot of these calls that that are focused on energy, or they're focused on transportation, or they're focused on housing, or they're just focusing on a component of a city. There's billions of dollars being invested into sustainable cities, green cities, and where we're finding success. I put the information in the chat, is putting it all in context. We don't just go out and build energy systems. We build them in context of where we live, where we work, where we play. And so using the eco village and eco districts templates, we are driving the conversation around the infrastructure, which is exactly what you're trying to put in place. And because of that context, we have been able to attract several large investors who are looking at district scale developments. And obviously, like I said, several things you said lend towards that. So
Right.
are you finding similar interest or finding similar experiences when you put transportation or when you put hydrogen in the context of community and city building?
Robert, thank you for the question. I think the short answer is absolutely. And appreciate you joining us from maybe one of the few places on the planet where maybe you'd welcome a little bit more global warming. But I think one, putting it in context, absolutely critical. Two, defining a well thought out use case with a clear offtake. I mean, this is a physical commodity we're talking about producing that is not moved by wire, right? It's got to be moved by a pipeline or in some other alternate form. And the third point I would make in this regard is that a year ago, 2 years ago, lots of interest, a bit of skepticism on part of senior executives at major companies as well as banks. But today, since IRA, when I talk to people at, large investing companies, I won't name them, or large banks, I won't name them, many of the questions I get are, hey, of all these customers you're talking to, you've been in this hydrogen space a long time. Can you tell me a couple of these projects that you think have the best chance of moving forward or the most baked? And if they need money, please pass them on, because, we're aggressively looking to invest in the space. And that is a phenomenon I've seen change 180 degrees since IRA. This all got a lot more real. I don't believe IRA and its provisions will be limited to the US. I think that other large economies will copy it and we'll be back to parity.
Just to swing back to the original question, for those of you that are in the processes, if you have a particular application, something that you're working on, and you'd like to find out, ask a question to Rick about it, now's the time. Do we have any other hands that are up right now? I'm not sure that we do, but I wanted to see.
Yeah, I see Joffrey has his hand up.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry, Joff.
Geoffrey.
Go ahead. Go for it. Good to see you.
Hi, how are you? Well, this question is for Rick. As we move forward to electrification, wouldn't it make sense to worry first and fixing the grid, and especially if we're moving with the hydrogen alternative as a production of energy, wouldn't it make more sense to produce this electricity locally using hydrogen instead of transporting it across nations? Thank you.
Joffrey, thank you for the question. And I think it really depends upon what is the profile of the renewable electricity resource that might already be available in a geography that you would use to make hydrogen, to then, reconvert back into electricity. And I talked a bit about using storage as a way to make abundant hydrogen while there's an abundant renewable resource, and then, meter it out and use it when there's not an abundant renewable resource. But I think one challenge I always see when I pull out, and I'm old enough to still carry an HP 12C around with me, right? I can't think without it. My kids think I'm nuts because they'd say, why don't you just put the app on your phone, Dad?
Right.
But the round trip efficiency of going electricity to hydrogen and back to electricity from just a efficiency of the production of hydrogen as electrolysis, and then burning it in a gas turbine or burning it in a fuel cell, not burning it, but processing it in a fuel cell back to electricity, as well as all the CapEx of, again, conversion into hydrogen and conversion back into electricity. Unless there is some driving force like for 12 hours a day, we have so much renewable power, we don't know what else to do with it, and it's free or it's negative cost. Unless you're in a scenario like that, which is prevalent in some places in the world and probably over time, maybe more so, I always just think that, that case, Joffrey, is tough to sort of pencil out.
So a couple other questions. What do you think are some of the limiting factors for expanding the production and utilization of clean hydrogen? And I'm going to mix that with another question, which is, do you see political resistance to clean hydrogen?
So if we take clean hydrogen in the broadest definition by volume and say really what we're talking about is blue and green here, and I'll tackle those sequentially before we touch the political question that you raised. Production of blue is really gated by two things. One, you need to have abundant and low-cost natural gas. And, you know, we're blessed in some parts of the world to have that. In other parts of the world, as we've learned since last February, you know, not so blessed. That has to go hand in hand with a well-understood set of sequestration geology. So, you know, when you capture that CO2, in other words, to blue up the hydrogen, you can feel confident that when you put it underground, that it's going to stay there. And that means not a whole lot of geologic formations underground, like fissures, not a whole lot of existing perforations. Think of other wells nearby, and just a very well understood set of cap rockers. What geologists on the call, if there are any, would educate me and say it's called a fetch trap, right, in the shape of the formation. So that's blue. So what's gated is, you know, you can produce all the blue in the world that you want if you have cheap gas and something to do with the CO2. On green, it's really how much renewable electricity do you have access to, and then how much of it do you want to use to directly electrify, from that being the best use for that energy versus conversion into hydrogen and using it for some of these other things we've talked about. There is some chatter that there's going to be a shortage of electrolyzers if all these projects happen. You know, clearly I would love that to be the case, and I think it's very possible that that could be the case in the near term. What I would say is we just built our gigafactory, which we started up last year in 14 months in California. California, as many of you know, is not an easy place to construct anything. So, you know, our next factory is probably not in California, and, you know, we'll just edit, copy, paste the design. So I think the world in the industry, and not just Bloom, can respond to, you know, oh my God, the world's going to run out of electrolyzers. Probably isn't immediate. If you're interested in an electrolyzer project, you know, go talk to the various technology providers, because, you know, there could be a supply crunch in the meantime.
Got it.
Finally,
So-
political, right? You raised political. 5 years ago, yes. Since COVID, and I really saw a sea change in attitudes. I don't know if we all as a species had time because we were sitting at home with our families and wanted to ponder the meaning of life and what sort of planet are we leaving our children and our grandchildren. Since
Right.
COVID, people are much more supportive, and I think that goes all the way up to government leaders. Not to make this a political statement, but, you know, the Biden administration has done a lot for, you know, clean electricity and clean power, and that'll happen in other places as well.
Got it. So I see Steve Hughes. He's coming from Logistics Supply, Ocean Freight. Steve, your question?
Yeah, hello, everybody. I've seen some really interesting research being done on gallium aluminum oxide and hydrogen production. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because this seems like it seems too good to be true right now, but.
Yeah, I think, Steve, and thank you for that. There is a lot that seems too good to be true right now. If you turn your computer on and read about things, I think that's one, and I hope the technology shows promise. I've seen, you know, some things going around on the internet that there's a couple of people that claim they can make hydrogen directly from seawater in an electrolyzer without any sort of desalinization, parasitic load and capex, and that also seems to me sort of too good to be true. I read one thing that someone sent me where, you know, some university students discovered that loud noises help you know, excite the water molecule as it's going into an electrolyzer. I see a few people nodding and chuckling. And I think they discovered that by playing Metallica in their lab late at night or something like that. So, you know, many of these things I think you have to take with a grain of salt. A lot of the technologies we're discussing here in terms of production of green and blue are proven, and we just need to scale them up and practice it at a larger scale. And look, we do need new technology. We do need more than the technologies we have. And I believe personally that all the technologies, whether it's for production of green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, different types of electrolyzers, different types of synthesis gas production, they all have their place. And we're going to need all of these and more if we're going to go back to that sort of introductory challenge that I threw out there of holding global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C.
Right. Hey, Kevin, I can see your question. Could you summarize that real quickly for us, Kevin Mullen?
Sure.
Kevin, are you there?
Hi. Hi, John. Sorry about that. Hey, guys. Yeah, I was just curious to hear your perspective, or anyone's perspective, I guess, on how the market is interpreting kind of this opportunity. Because as we go forward, right now, the one stable, clean energy opportunity is hydro, large hydro, and that in combination with an electrolyzer is maybe the most efficient way to produce green hydrogen. And it's very different cost profile from anything else like offshore wind plus energy storage or anything else that's available. So I was just curious, is hydro and or some of the new emerging clean techs that have the potential to be stable at some point in the future, is that where the industry is hoping to get to, or is the industry most likely to just keep tweaking the established sources of energy and using that whole myriad of colors of hydrogen production?
So let me take a crack at that, and then I'll shut up and open up for other perspectives. I think that the issue with hydro, right, is that there's not enough of it here in the US. There are certainly other parts of the world and other parts of North America. So we think of our great neighbors to the north up in Canada that are blessed with abundant hydro resources that can be further scaled. And we're looking at some projects with project developers in Canada and other places where they are taking advantage of the properties of it's clean and it's low cost once it's built, and it's 24/7 as long as there was, adequate snow the winter before. The other point, Kevin, that we see is nuclear, and there's probably a wide range of opinions of how clean nuclear actually is, and I don't want to stir that pot any further. But what I would say is that from a carbon intensity of generation standpoint, we're very excited about nuclear. And the nuclear industry undergoing a renaissance driven by clean energy and pertinent clean hydrogen production. And I talked about Bloom's technology in solid oxide as high temperature. We mate very well to high temperature end customer processes. That can be substituted if we're paired with a nuclear reactor and take very, very low grade steam as the feed of the water molecule into the electrolyzer. So otherwise, I think to your point, it is developers are looking at trying to stack in the most efficient and best way possible, wind and solar, and hopefully that's as complementary as you can get.
Well, I think that's the last word, unless there's anything else that you wanted to say to the group, Rick.
Thank you all for the time today. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I think, John, you'll probably post something out there on a link if you want to get in touch with me and engage further. Of course, I'm also on LinkedIn, and again, appreciate everyone's time and interest. Have a great rest of your day.
Well, thanks, Rick. And folks, how was the talk and discussion today? You'll see that we're running the survey. Please take that 30-second survey. We're looking forward to improving ourselves continually through your feedback. And like Rick said, the post-show notes with everybody's contact information, resources will hit your mailbox very soon. So please take the time to connect with each other. This is just the beginning. You've opened up a whole new network of networks. Next up on the Energy Transition channel, March 7th. If geothermal energy is clean, stable, cost-effective, and can be delivered in a small footprint and built anywhere, what's holding it down? Kevin Mullen, CEO, GreenQuest Power, shares how they are removing the remaining barriers and approaching key challenges ahead. Learn more and register for this and other shows on our website, fte.network. Folks, we're out of time. Once again, thank you, Rick, and all of you for making time to connect and learn on the Energy Transition Channel. Thanks again, everybody. Take care. Have a great